To conclude our look at Asterisk Dialplan concepts, we will look at subroutines in the Asterisk Dialplan. In programming, a subroutine is a section of code that is referenced or called from various other places in the program, often to reduce repetition. The Asterisk Dialplan scripting implements a similar concept. There are a number of methods available to the Asterisk administrator to prevent the extensions.conf file from becoming unnecessarily large and cumbersome, including a technique to minimize the repetition of similar extensions. One common approach to using subroutines is to create a standard user's template so that the Dialplan logic applied to extensions for internal users does not have to be repeated. Consider this Dialplan excerpt designed to route a call to the appropriate voicemail greeting. The first line of the extension, 6001, dials phone-1. If phone 1 doesn't answer, the goToIf will route the call based on the value of the dial status channel variable. If the dial status is busy, the call will be routed to the busy priority, and voicemail will play the busy voicemail greeting. If the dial status is anything other than busy, the call will fall through to the next priority and voicemail will play the unavailable greeting. It would be tedious and potentially difficult to replicate the same basic call flow for hundreds or thousands of other extensions, especially if there were even more priorities. But in a system with many similar extensions, this is what we'd have to do if there weren't a more elegant solution. Thankfully, there is a better way. The foremost method for consolidating similar extensions to reduce repetition is to create a sort of template called a macro. We'll demonstrate exactly how this works in the next slide. To begin, we move our Dialplan logic to a special context prefixed with the word macro, followed by a dash. Here we have a macro named example, so the context name is macro-example. Note that we've changed the extension from 6001 to S or start. All macros use the S extension. This is because macros are not dialed to directly. Instead, the macro application is called from another part of the Dialplan, with the macro name passed as an argument. We'll modify the previously defined extension 6001 by commenting out the old extension and creating a new line with a macro named example. It's that easy. In the example in the last slide, the macro name was the only argument to macro, but you can optionally provide additional arguments separated by commas. These arguments can be strings, numbers, and variables. The arguments will then be stored in channel variables that can be referenced in the macro. The variables are called arg1, arg2, and so on. In this trivial example, the extension 6001 calls a macro named argtest and passes the additional arguments of someText and 17. Within the macro, priority 1 of extension S is a call to no-op that will print the value of arg1. arg2 is printed in the next no-op. So the asterisk console will print the string someText and then 17 when extension 6001 is dialed. By itself, this isn't very useful, but we can use this approach to make macros much more powerful. Another important detail regarding Dialplan macros is that there are several channel variables that are automatically assigned when a macro is called. The Dialplan context, extension, and priority are all recorded in channel variables of the same name. This is always true, regardless of where in the Dialplan the call is or how it got there. So inside a macro, context will be the name of the macro, in this case, macro example, and extend will be S. But it can also be valuable to know where the macro was called from. The variables macro_context, macro_extend, and macro_priority store the values that were current when the macro was called. In the earlier macro example, macro context is internal_users, and macro extend is 6001. You can compare these to the values of context and extend to see the difference. The macro example we've built so far is only half complete. It's functional and it demonstrates how macros work, but it doesn't really simplify the Dialplan any because it's hard-coded to dial the phone that was originally configured at extension 6001. To make macros really powerful, we need them to be able to apply to multiple users. This means that the macro should not be hard-coded to a device name or mailbox. We can use Dialplan variables to make the macro more generic. Here we call the macro with the additional argument of the SIP device that was originally associated with the extension that now calls a macro. Inside the macro, we look at the arg1 variable to know which SIP device to dial, and we use the macro extend variable to know which mailbox to use. Now our macro is complete. The macro itself is 6 lines long. If we typed out those same 6 lines for 1,000 users, changing the dial and voicemail lines for each user, we'd have 6,000 lines of Dialplan. Using a macro, we have a single line for each user that maps their SIP device to an extension and calls the 6-line macro. So we've eliminated the need for almost 5,000 lines of Dialplan. Now imagine if the macro were more complicated and had 30 lines. And what if there were 10,000 users? Macros are clearly valuable in any Dialplan where several extensions behave very similarly. Hopefully, you can now appreciate the power of Dialplan macros. Before we move on to another topic, we'd like to discuss some of the gotchas related to the use of macros. The technical details behind these gotchas aren't likely to be relevant, so we've omitted them. It is possible to call a macro from inside another macro, but only to a maximum depth of 7 macros. If you need to deeply nest macro calls, you should look at the Go sub and related applications instead. They behave in a similar way, but don't have the same limitation on nesting depth. The waitExtend application will not function as expected when called from within a macro. You should instead use the read application when it's necessary to get DTMF input from a caller while inside a macro. It can be confusing to use an application in the GoTo family to exit a macro by specifying a different context to route to. While it is possible to do so, we don't recommend it unless there's no alternative. In this module, we demonstrated how the macro application can be used to streamline the Asterisk Dialplan by condensing groups of similar extensions. Effective use of this technique on large and complicated systems can save thousands of lines of Dialplan. This makes it much easier to maintain and troubleshoot the system. This concludes the Advanced Dialplan chapter. We've discussed not only Dialplan subroutines, but several other powerful concepts, including Dialplan functions and expressions, as well as conditional branching. In the next chapter, we will analyze the implementation of call queuing in Asterisk.